Tonight we begin with a development that senior US and UK officials had feared, anticipated, and quietly prepared for behind closed doors. A development that unfolded not over weeks or months of diplomatic back and forth, but in a matter of hours. Hours that changed the strategic calculus of this conflict. Hours that forced the Pentagon to revise its threat assessments. Hours that left European capitals scrambling to coordinate their next move. What Vladimir Putin did today crossed a line that Washington and London had desperately hoped would hold. And when that line broke, the Western alliance did not hesitate. They responded with unity, with resolve, and with a level of military commitment that has not been seen since the earliest days of this war. This is what happens when an authoritarian leader miscalculates. This is what happens when he assumes division where there is none. And this is what happens when the United States and the United Kingdom decide to send a message that cannot be misunderstood. Tonight, we're going to walk through exactly what happened, why it matters, and what it tells us about the next phase of this conflict. Because what Putin did today didn't just shock the world. It may have changed the trajectory of this entire war. For several weeks now, there had been signals, not official statements from the Kremlin, not formal declarations from Moscow's diplomatic corps, just signals that Vladimir Putin was preparing something unprecedented. Putin has been aggressive, yes, but he has been calculated in his aggression. His moves have followed a certain logic, a rhythm, almost a predictability. Western intelligence agencies had grown accustomed to reading the patterns, the troop movements, the logistical buildups, the propaganda campaigns that typically precede major military operations. But what set off alarm bells in Washington and London this week was that the pattern went silent. Analysts who monitor Russian military communications know the indicators. The surge in encrypted traffic between Moscow and field commanders. The repositioning of strategic assets closer to Ukrainian borders. The public statements from Kremlin-aligned media preparing the Russian population for escalation. The sudden silence from Putin himself, no public appearances, no speeches, no carefully staged photo opportunities. All of that went quiet. And whenever Vladimir Putin goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Intelligence officials on both sides of the Atlantic began comparing notes. The CIA's Russia desk was in constant communication with MI6. NATO's intelligence sharing protocols were activated at the highest level. Everyone was watching. Everyone was waiting. And then, in the early hours of Tuesday morning, they got their answer. Early Tuesday morning, U.S. satellite reconnaissance detected what they described as an unprecedented mobilization of Russian strategic forces, including the activation of command and control systems that had not been brought online in over 18 months. These are the kinds of assets that Russia only deploys when they are signaling something very specific. Preparation for a major offensive, a dramatic escalation in targeting, or a fundamental shift in how they intend to prosecute this war. Western analysts didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Putin was changing his posture. And when a nuclear-armed adversary shifts posture without explanation, even by the smallest measure, the Pentagon and Downing Street pay attention. Within hours, President Biden was briefed in the Situation Room. Prime Minister Keir Starmer was pulled from a scheduled event for an emergency security meeting. And in Kyiv, President Zelensky was informed that the threat level had just increased dramatically. What came next would test the Western alliance like nothing since the invasion began. The warning issued by the U.S. Department of Defense tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Official after official emerging from classified briefings described Putin's move as destabilizing, reckless, and perhaps most importantly, deliberately provocative, designed to test whether the Western alliance would fracture under pressure. Putin's strategy has always relied on exploiting divisions. He looks for cracks in the Western facade. He probes for weakness. He waits for hesitation. But hesitation only works if the target flinches. The US and UK did not. In fact, their response today was among the most coordinated and forceful we've seen in the entire conflict. Here's what we know. Within 6 hours of detecting Russia's mobilization, the United States announced a new emergency military aid package for Ukraine worth $2.3 billion. These weren't the standard defensive systems that have characterized previous aid packages. These were advanced offensive capabilities, long-range precision strike systems, enhanced air defense batteries, and intelligence-sharing protocols that the U.S. only activates when they are preparing to support a major military operation. The United Kingdom followed within the hour. Defense Secretary John Healey appeared alongside his American counterpart to announce that Britain would be providing Storm Shadow missiles with extended-range capabilities, as well as additional training for Ukrainian Special Operations Forces. This was not a press release. This was a statement of intent. Tonight, the Pentagon confirmed that Ukraine launched coordinated strikes on Russian military positions, including a command center in occupied Crimea that had recently been reinforced with additional air defense systems for what analysts believe was preparation for a spring offensive. Ukraine struck before Russia could consolidate its defensive positions. They hit the command center. They hit the ammunition depots feeding the southern front. They hit the railway junctions that were likely preparing to move reinforcements from Russia's interior. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of Russia's military operation in the south. The logistics, the communications, the coordination, the components that would have made a Russian offensive operational. This is what made the Pentagon's warning so urgent. Putin's mobilization wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of preparation that could fundamentally alter the battlefield if left unchecked. And Ukraine, with the full backing of the United States and United Kingdom, responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't scatter their resources across the entire front line. They didn't waste their new capabilities on targets of minimal value. They hit the command infrastructure. They hit the supply lines. They hit the systems that Russia needs to coordinate any large-scale military operation. And in doing so, they sent a message that was heard in Moscow, in Washington, in London, and in every capital watching this conflict unfold. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. U.S. intelligence officials now believe that Putin's latest move was designed to test the resolve of Western support after months of political uncertainty in both the United States and Europe. Putin wanted to see whether the alliance would delay its response while politicians debated. He wanted to see whether budget concerns would slow down military aid. He wanted to see whether the approaching U.S. election cycle would make Washington hesitant to commit. But instead, the opposite happened. Washington and London didn't hesitate. They issued a joint response that was so swift, so comprehensive, that even the Kremlin noticed. You don't get Vladimir Putin's attention easily. He has spent decades learning to ignore Western criticism, to dismiss sanctions, to brush aside diplomatic protests. But today, the US and UK did something he couldn't ignore. They put their money where their rhetoric has been. Senior defense analysts speaking with NBC News under anonymity described Putin's initial move as a stress test, a way to probe the structural integrity of the Western alliance before committing to a larger operation. But the US and UK proved today that they remain both united and capable of rapid response. Their actions were not only decisive, they were timed so precisely that the strikes occurred before Russian forces could disperse or reinforce their positions. That timing matters because it shows real-time intelligence sharing at the highest level. It shows that Ukraine is not operating in isolation. They are operating as a fully integrated partner of the Western alliance. And that integration is something Putin fundamentally underestimated. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of the Western response. The United States activated additional intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets over the Black Sea, forcing Russian naval vessels to retreat to more defensive positions. British cyber operations reportedly targeted communications infrastructure that had been upgraded by Russia in the last 90 days. NATO AWACS aircraft operating from Polish airspace reportedly provided real-time targeting data used by Ukrainian forces to coordinate their strikes with unprecedented precision. This wasn't just military aid. This wasn't just diplomatic solidarity. This was operational integration. This was warfighting coordination. And warfighting coordination is the one thing Vladimir Putin has struggled to counter since this invasion began. For every territorial advance Russia has made, Ukraine and its Western partners have countered with something that degrades Russia's ability to hold, reinforce, or exploit those gains. Putin has learned, again and again, that capturing territory is not the same as controlling it. And tonight, that lesson was reinforced in the most concrete terms possible. Remember, Vladimir Putin thought the West would lose interest after the first year. He thought European energy dependence would fracture NATO unity. He thought American political divisions would make sustained support impossible. He thought wrong. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. The United States is providing its most advanced weapons systems yet. The United Kingdom is expanding its training and support programs. NATO is more unified than at any point since the Cold War. And Ukraine is demonstrating that it can integrate Western capabilities faster than Russia can adapt. This is not what Putin expected. This is not what he planned for. And tonight, for the first time in months, you can see the uncertainty in Moscow's response. The Kremlin's initial statement was delayed by several hours, unusual for an administration that typically has its propaganda machine primed and ready. When Dmitry Peskov finally appeared before cameras, his talking points felt stale, recycled from previous crises. He warned of consequences. He accused the West of escalation. He threatened responses that would be proportional and devastating. But there was something missing from his delivery. Conviction. Because tonight, even the Kremlin appears to understand that something has shifted. What makes this moment so critical and so dangerous is that Putin's latest move happened at a time when he is under extraordinary pressure from multiple directions. Russian military commanders want more troops and better equipment to break the stalemate on the front lines. Russian oligarchs want an end to sanctions that have decimated their fortunes and limited their global mobility. Russian nationalists want escalation. They've been pushing for full mobilization, for the use of more devastating weapons, for a war fought without restraint. And Russian mothers want their sons to come home from a war that was supposed to last 3 days and has now stretched into its 3rd year. Putin is balancing these demands while trying to maintain the facade of a leader in complete control. And when leaders in that position make sudden, dramatic moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. They're doing it because they feel the walls closing in and they need to create a distraction, a crisis, or a victory, anything to change the narrative. That's what makes this moment so volatile. Putin needs something to show for this war. And when he can't get it on the battlefield, he looks for it through escalation. The Pentagon's statement, now circulating through every major newsroom in the world, was designed to signal that the United States is not willing to allow Russian intimidation to succeed. Officials said plainly that Putin's military mobilization was inconsistent with any genuine interest in de-escalation or diplomatic resolution. That is diplomatic language for, "We see what you're doing, and we're not backing down." You don't usually hear that tone from the Department of Defense unless something serious is at stake. The statement went on to emphasize that the United States remains committed to providing Ukraine with the capabilities it needs to defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Note the word choice, sovereignty and territorial integrity. That's not just about defending current positions. That's about recovering lost territory. That's about Crimea. That's about the Donbass. That's about everything Russia has seized since 2014. The United Kingdom's statement was equally forceful, with the Foreign Office declaring that Russian aggression will be met with unwavering resolve from the United Kingdom and our allies. These are not throwaway lines. These are carefully crafted signals designed to be read in Moscow. And tonight, Moscow is reading them very carefully. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed his nation in a defiant, measured speech tonight. He said, "Ukraine does not stand alone. Today, our partners have shown that their commitment is not just words, it is action." He said, "Every weapon delivered, every sanction enforced, every intelligence shared brings us closer to victory." And he said, "To those who thought we would tire, who thought we would compromise, who thought we would surrender, you have your answer tonight." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a wartime leader who understands just how high the stakes have become. Zelensky has walked a careful line throughout this conflict, grateful for Western support while constantly pushing for more. Tonight, that push appears to have paid off. The capabilities Ukraine is receiving now are capabilities that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago. And the coordination between Kyiv, Washington, and London is operating at a level that suggests this partnership has become permanent. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Putin's latest move wasn't isolated. Along with the military mobilization inside Russia, Belarus conducted joint military exercises with Russian forces along the Ukrainian border, exercises that included simulated attacks on NATO territory. Russian cyber operations launched a coordinated campaign against Ukrainian government websites, attempting to disrupt communications during the most sensitive hours of the crisis. And Russian state media increased its propaganda output by 300%, targeting Western audiences with messages designed to undermine support for Ukraine. All of this happened within the same 48-hour window. When Putin moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. He's not just testing Ukraine. He's testing the entire Western security architecture. He's probing for weaknesses in our alliances, in our resolve, in our attention spans. And tonight, he got his answer. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Putin is preparing for a major spring offensive, using this mobilization to position forces for a renewed push toward Kyiv or along the Eastern Front. Another is that Putin is attempting to create a crisis significant enough to force negotiations on his terms, to freeze the conflict with Russian forces holding as much territory as possible. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Putin is attempting to establish a new normal of constant escalation, testing how far he can push before the West responds. But today, the United States and United Kingdom took that card off the table. They didn't wait for Putin to complete his mobilization. They didn't engage in weeks of diplomatic hand-wringing. They didn't allow the uncertainty to paralyze their response. They acted swiftly, decisively, and together. What we're watching now is a test of endurance. Putin wants to see if Western support will outlast Russian resilience. Ukraine wants to show that it can win if properly equipped and supported. The United States wants to prevent this conflict from expanding into a broader European war. And the United Kingdom wants to prevent any perception that aggression can succeed. All of these objectives are aligned tonight. But alignment requires maintenance. It requires continued investment. It requires political courage in capitals where voters are tired and budgets are strained. That's the real test. Not whether the West can respond to a single crisis, but whether the West can sustain that response for as long as it takes. Tonight, we've heard from senior administration officials who are now monitoring Russian communications for any indication of how the Kremlin will respond. They say Russian military traffic has increased dramatically in the last 6 hours. They say there are signs that Russian forces are repositioning, whether to reinforce defensive positions or to prepare for retaliation remains unclear. And they say Putin's decision to mobilize strategic assets is likely part of a broader strategy intended to force the West into negotiations before Ukraine can capitalize on its new capabilities. But Ukraine is not waiting for negotiations. In fact, Ukraine is accelerating its operations. Their response today, swift, precise, and devastatingly effective, sent a message to Putin that he cannot simply wait out Western support. And it sent a message to the United States and United Kingdom that their investment is paying dividends. Every dollar spent on Ukrainian defense is a dollar that doesn't have to be spent on American soldiers in Europe. Every British missile that destroys a Russian command center is a missile that prevents a larger war. That's the calculation that drove today's response. And that's the calculation that will drive what comes next. As the coming days unfold, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve with this mobilization. But what we do know is that the Western response was timely. It prevented Russia from gaining a strategic advantage. It demonstrated that NATO's commitment to Ukraine remains ironclad. And it showed Putin that miscalculation carries consequences. What happens next will depend on what the Kremlin does in the coming days and weeks. If they escalate further, this moment will be remembered as a turning point, the moment when the West made clear that there are limits to what it will tolerate. If they back down, the United States and United Kingdom have already shown they are prepared for that too. They have shown they are ready to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. They have shown they are ready to respond. And they have shown that, when democracy is tested, democracies can rise to meet the challenge. And tonight, for the first time in many months, Vladimir Putin appears to be reassessing. The Kremlin is quiet. Too quiet. And when Putin is quiet, it means he is calculating. It means he is weighing his options. It means he is choosing his next move carefully. Because tonight, Vladimir Putin learned something he should have learned long ago. The West is not divided. The West is not tired. And the West is not going anywhere. This story is far from over. The war in Ukraine will continue. The human cost will continue to mount. The stakes will continue to rise. But tonight, one thing is clear. Ukraine is not alone. The alliance holds. And Vladimir Putin's gamble has, once again, failed to break what he cannot understand. And we will be here, watching every detail, reporting every development, as the next phase of this historic conflict unfolds.